Afternoon. Happy Friday. It has been a long week of grading projects and just doing all the things. Hi Gov Healthcare, a MASH IBM commercial. I know, I love all of those. There is like an archive of really old commercials and things, and I love really old like commercials for games and computers and technology stuff, and the way that we used to really promote and sell those products is really different than the way we do it now. And so I love that. I have a bunch of different commercials. I'm thinking about switching that video out every now and then just so that it doesn't get old. But welcome. I'm glad we could get together to do some of this week because I'm still focused on my goals of getting all of this information that I have about the Amazon Web Services Cloud Practitioner Exam down into the GitHub repository that I've been working in. I did take some time offline this week, did online stuff offline, off stream, to organize this document a little better. So I was originally just like, it was all one document and it was getting like super long. And so I've actually broken out into the 4 domains. And if you need the link to this document, this primary document that then links into all the other ones that we're going to be working in, you can do !GitHub and get the link to this particular Cloud Practitioner section. But really, this is part 3 at this point. Done several hours so far of just trying to get through, what's on the exam, what to expect. So at this point, if I click on domain 1 here, we can look at our domain 1 document. We finished domain 1 and we were working on domain 2, which is all about security and compliance. We talked quite a bit about regions and availability zones, tools of cost management, which I put this here in domain 2 because that's where it is in my notes. But honestly, over here in domain 4, there's all this stuff about billing and pricing. So I might honestly move it because I have everything in like a OneNote notebook. But honestly, it probably belongs in domain 4. So I might end up moving that. But in the domain 2, we also had some study questions about like availability zones and things like that. Scenario questions. You see a lot of scenario questions on this exam. So that's what I've been focusing on. So I'm gonna pick up where I left off with domain 2. And so let's see, we're talking about cloud security. So let me get into my notebook and start talking about some security topics. And the problem is the way these topics are kind of presented is not necessarily the order. Like if you aren't familiar already with the topic, then it might not be the appropriate place to start, like from an educational standpoint. So like if you don't know anything about the AWS services, then jumping into cloud security is probably not a great place to do that. Let's see, let me go back. What did we have? See, we already talked a little bit about the global infrastructure, and we need to talk about core services. So I might honestly start here and then come back. But in this cloud concepts, we talked about benefits of cloud computing and types of cloud computing and the cloud deployment models. And that goes into a lot of this section here about global infrastructure. But let's just hop in right here. Instead of actually saying I'm going to pick up where I left off with domain 2 and talk about security, I think if you're new to this topic, you're not really familiar with everything that the AWS cloud has to offer, then talking about these core concepts is probably the best place to start. So let's see. What do we have? Security, architecture, understanding what the cloud is. I have stuff on different types of framework, the shared responsibility model, compliance. All right, hold on. There's a whole section in here on interacting with AWS, but it's like, where did that fit in our different domains? I'm sure it's on here. Deploying and operating in the cloud. That's probably in here. Let's just start here. Yeah. So this is methods of connecting to AWS. And let me make this bigger so that you can read it. All right, so we've looked a little bit at the dashboard, and I can hop back in there. Let's see, these are all the links I had open last time. So, we talked about if you don't already have an account, then of course you would want to make one just so that you can I have the wrong password saved, isn't that fun? So that you can get in here and mess with a bunch of the different services, and we were looking at cost management last time. But this way you can get in here and look at all of these different technologies and stuff. And so when we're talking about interacting with these services, there really is 3 different approaches to being able to use these various services. So our 3 different approaches, like the first of those would be the console, right? So the console where you log in and you click on all of the various things. You can look at this build a solution section, and it'll talk to you about which services maybe that you want to use. There's tutorials and things in here on how to build, or you can come in here and look at all of the services kind of broken down into their various categories. So the console, of course, is I think where most people start, just because if you set up an account, then you're going to automatically have access to the console. So the next one is the AWS CLI, which is command line interface. And this is what allows you to access those same services, but from the command line of terminal on your machine. And this can be really helpful, especially if you are wanting to maybe script out the launching of some different services. If you have kind of scenarios maybe that you set up with various clients, or you want to really leverage, being able to replicate different items, maybe bring up servers and things very quickly, then you could create a series of command line commands that would execute those things on your behalf. So if you wanted to program access to your AWS resources, then you would look at the AWS SDK. That's Software Development Kit, if you're not familiar with what SDK stands for. So this would allow you to access the AWS resources inside of a custom application. And the AWS SDK is actually really easy to work with. If you go look at any of the videos that I've done on like Lambda programming and things, you can get the SDK as a snap-in tool for Visual Studio, which then allows you to leverage all of the information from directly inside of the IDE. So that makes it very easy. There is support for multiple languages inside of the SDK. So I don't know, we want to dig into these deeper if that makes sense. Let's see, I have a couple of things though. The management console, right, that's the browser version. There's also a mobile application. I've never used the mobile application or had any reason to install it, but maybe that's useful for some people. There's like 150 plus services available on AWS, and they're pretty much all available through the console, so you can access it that way. And you know, one of the things I talked about when we were talking about availability zones is this drop down up here in the console that lets us see which current availability zone we're working in. So the console always looks the same, but like if I switch over here to US East Ohio, you can see that the interface looks the same, but any resources, like if I come in here and create some EC2 instances, I'm currently in the Ohio region up here, US East 2, and so they would be created in that data center as opposed to US East 1, which is that Northern Virginia one that we looked at in the last session where we had the map and everything. So, you know, the console is always going to look the same. You want to pay attention to which availability zone that you're working in. With the command line tool, if you want to get things maybe a little more programmatically, like a list of current users on a specified account, or if you're wanting to look at user roles and things like that, it's sometimes a little easier to go through the command line interface than it is to go through the console and run the reports and things. With the SDK, like I said, there's a lot of different languages it supports. Here I've got Java, .NET, PHP, Python, Ruby, Go, and C++. I don't think that's changed. We could go check out the documentation to be sure, but you know, hopefully you're working in one of those languages and would be able to leverage the SDK if you wanted to do that. But the SDK ultimately allows you to write some custom tools and do some custom programming and things. So I guess that's helpful if you're not really sure how to connect with AWS and use some of these different things. Yeah. So I don't know how much of that I need to talk about. We're going to start to talk about some of these various services. So like, I'm going to move this tab. We see all of these things in here, but we can start to talk about the core services. So let's start with, well, I was talking about Amazon EC2, so let's start there. So EC2, oh my gosh, you would think that typing is like a required skill or something and that I would know how to do this very well. So we're gonna start, let's start with the compute services. On the Cloud Practitioner Exam, there's kind of a high level, like what are compute services that enable you to leverage like cloud-based virtual machines for your workloads, databases, web servers, data processing, like whatever you're using them for. And so that's why we cover this, and it's part of our domains. So talking about those kind of foundational core services is important. Yeah, so let's start with EC2. EC2 is like one of the fundamental core services of AWS, and it allows you to create resizable compute capacity in the cloud. So it's basically like virtual computers, right? So like you need a computer to do something specific, like host your web application or host your database. And that's essentially what EC2 is designed to do. So you can choose to spin up an EC2 instance, which is a very, an instance would be like one computer of a specific size and type. And then on that instance, like maybe you then install your web server, and then on that web server, you could put your files where you're going to, your files for your web application. And maybe that's it. Maybe that meets the need, right? But you can also do like really complex things like batch processing of data. So maybe your organization produces like 1 million rows of data in your point of sale application every day, and you want to do some pre-processing on that before maybe you analyze it or create reports, and you could bring up an EC2 instance server to do that. There's a lot of different use cases, really any place where you might want to use a server. So there is, let me pull up, and we can put the link in here to like Amazon's documentation as well. This is the EC2 homepage. You can see that, it really stands for Elastic Compute Cloud, which is why it's C2. Which availability zones and regions that you could have, instances. There's some case studies in here about companies that are using it and things like that, who uses EC2 and how do they use it, and what different sizes and types and things are there. So the key, let's get this link. The key here is that it's virtual servers. So you can bring up different types, and we can come in here to the instance type section and get some more understanding of this. But depending on what you're doing with your EC2 instance, you can kind of decide like how much do I need? What size of instance do I need? And we can see here that they're broken down into things like general purpose, compute optimized, memory optimized, accelerated computing, storage optimized, instance features, and then measuring instance performance. And inside of each one of these categories, you can see we have these tabs that give us various types of instances underneath this category and what they're for. So like the most basic one here, EC2 A1 instances, they're for cost savings, for scale out and ARM-based workloads, extensive ARM ecosystem, right? Those kinds of things. And then you have, might you need in terms of CPU and memory and network performance. There's different types of storage. And again, like we didn't talk about storage. So like, this is one of those things where like, if you're not sure what types of storage are available on AWS, you would need to go check it out. And then they give you like use cases. So if you wanted like a small web server or a small microservice or something like that, then this is the type of instance that you would use. And you would want to look at then, like once you've identified maybe which type you need, you could go look at pricing and get an idea of, like because again, with the cloud, you only pay for what you use, but you can, it depends on what you're using, like how much each one of these instance types costs. So looking at these different instance types in here, like maybe I need a compute optimized one, ideal for compute bound applications that benefit from high performance processors, right? We can see 3 different types in here. Memory optimized for fast performance of workloads that process high data sets, large data sets in memory. And it gives you the specs. We can see what kind of processors. how much memory per instance. And you can see these start to get quite large, right? So up here, right, in these different large size ones, you know, we get a lot of virtual CPUs, we get an extreme amount of RAM, we get high availability on the network. So you're talking about processing a lot of data at once, like very high availability. These accelerated computing ones, right, for hardware accelerators, co-processors, it says, you know, good for performing functions such as floating point number calculations, graphic processing, data pattern matching. You start getting into these machine deep learning type scenarios. Storage optimized, if you require high sequential read and write with low latency or like random IO operations. So we start to get into like database applications. So are you running like Cassandra NoSQL databases or high transaction relational databases? Then these are great instances for those kinds of scenarios. They talk about the instance features. So before I get into the instance features, let's get into, so we have different types of instances based on need. So in the document over here, pull this over here, we had general, compute, memory, accelerated, and storage. So you can review, again, typing, to determine which type is best for your scenario. And then pricing varies based on the type of instance and size of instance. So then we also had so instance features. So this is what the next part of this page is talking about. So one of the big features that you get with EC2 is the ability to have burstable performance. So burstable performance is where you can choose a baseline level of CPU performance with the ability to burst up above the baseline. So these are great for some of the different scenarios that you might have with, you know, especially if you're using it for maybe like a web server or something that's publicly accessible. So let's say you have a web application and you're hosting it on a pretty small instance on EC2 to save money, and you get featured somewhere big, like you go viral on Twitter and people really love your application, and there's all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of people flooding to your website to use your application. If you just are stuck in that little instance size, then your application is just going to crash because there's going to be way too many people trying to access it, and you're not going to have the processor and the memory and the network availability to support suddenly hundreds of thousands of users if that's not what you planned for. And so that burstable performance will allow you to suddenly add in more resources on the fly without any interaction, so that you can support that sudden growth of usership. So, you know, you can set this up to like what your maximums are, and they give you, let me go back to the page here. They give you some overview as far as like an example in here. So for example, A T2 small size instance receives credits continuously at the rate of 12 CPU credits per hour. This capability provides baseline performance equivalent to 20% of a CPU core. So 20% times 60 minutes is 12 minutes, that's 12 CPU credits. If the instance does not use the credits it receives, they're stored in the CPU credit balance up to a maximum of 288 CPU credits. And when the T2 small instance needs to burst to more than 20% of a core, it draws from its CPU credit balance to handle the surge automatically. So you can kind of get in here and understand, you know, based on the size of the instance that I have, how much CPU credits am I using? Am I banking any of that? And if so, then how will my instance be able to scale up and burst up above that baseline should it need to? So it's a very important feature, and it goes back to what we talked about in terms of like what makes the cloud a better option than traditional data centers. And a lot of that has to do with the hands-off ability to handle these things. You know, if you're not the kind of organization that has someone monitoring your network availability and resources 24/7, what if you go viral at 3 in the morning, right? No one's around to take care of these things for you, and AWS's system will automatically provide those resources to the server so that you don't have to. So let's talk about the next one, which is storage options. So you have a couple of different storage options that Amazon EC2 allows you to choose from. Let's make some subheadings here. So we have Amazon EBS. This is pretty durable storage. It's block level. So this basically means that you can take this storage, you can carve out and say I need, you know, X gigabytes of storage space, and then attach it to a single running instance. You can use this as primary storage. For, you know, if you have data that requires like frequent granular updates. So like if you run a database, they persist independently. And that's important because that's not always true. So in some cases, depending on the type of storage you've used, when you shut down the instance, like maybe you're done with this web server, you just had it up for testing or whatever, it'll also delete your storage. And if you're not aware, you weren't ready, maybe that's not what you wanted. But Amazon's EBS is persistent, and so this can be helpful. Like if you're updating your web server instance size, like maybe you started in a T2 medium and your application has grown and your business has grown and your needs have grown, and you just decide, hey, a T2 large would be a better fit for us. You could take that storage where everything lives and detach it from the medium instance, bring up a large instance, and then get that storage reattached. And so that's really one of the benefits of it persisting independently from the instance. Once the volume is attached to the instance, it works like any other physical hard drive. You would not know otherwise. What else? There are 3 different volume types on Amazon EBS. And I think this is going to go over in our storage section, but it bears repeating here anyway. We're just going to keep nesting as deep as we can go here. So we have general purpose. which is SSD storage. Provisioned IOPS, also SSD storage. I think it's all SSD at this point. They don't use, they don't use anything else. I guess they have magnetic. I don't know who uses those. Why would you do that to yourself? The general purpose is, it's very much in the name, right? General purpose, EBS volumes, default choice, SSD backed, suitable for a large range of uses. You could say in here, including small to medium sized databases, development and test environments, boot volumes, right? All the things you use storage for. The provisioned IOPS volumes are storage with consistent and low latency performance. Designed for IO intensive operations, such as large relational or NoSQL databases. And then magnetic storage is, it's the lowest cost per gigabyte. Ideal for workloads where data is accessed infrequently, or applications where the lowest cost option is important, right? That's all good stuff. What else? We talked about, they've got some additional things in here. These EBS optimized instances. There are select instance types, and they tell you all of them in here, where this feature is enabled at no additional cost. But these particular instances are kind of fully provisioned to deliver dedicated throughput between the EC2 and storage services. So basically like really high traffic. And so of course these are going to be a little more expensive options for what you might want to do. And then there's some certain EC2 instances that support cluster networking. So when you launch these EC2 instances into a common cluster placement group, then they will have low latency networking between all instances in the cluster. And so if you had an application or a particular use case where that might be something necessary, then that's a feature as well. And so they dig in a little more into like which processors they're using. And then we'll get into this measuring performance and stuff later, but yeah. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with EC2 instances. And so we can go look in the console at how easy this is. Here's my console. So you can come into the EC2 section and it'll tell me if I have a running instance. You can see I do have one. Elastic IPs, so usually by default, your EC2 instances will not have a static IP, and you can assign one if that's necessary. You can set up things like load balancers and placement groups, security groups. We'll talk about that when we get to it. Volumes, this is that storage. So you can see what type of storage, when it was created, what it's attached to, if it's in use, all of that good stuff. And then if you do have instances here, you can see this T2 small is running, right? What it's doing, who started it, how long it's been up, those kinds of things. But if you want to launch an instance, it really is pretty easy to come up here and click Launch Instance. And then you can come choose one of these instance types. Now, it's not just an operating system sometimes, you know, but they do have various, you know, we can see here various types of Linux environments if you wanted to bring up a Linux one, different types of Microsoft Server. But then there's also ones that are already pre-configured for specific use cases, or maybe that are configured with other applications already in the image. So there's a few in here, you know, that come with SQL Server. And so when you bring it up, not only will it already be Windows Server 19 installed, but it will have SQL Server 2017 installed as well. Because these are, again, they're virtual computers, kind of like virtual machines, if you're familiar with that. You bring them up from an image file. And so if you already have an image file from a virtual machine, you can also load that into EC2 and bring up a virtual machine built off of the image that you have created. So this is great if you maybe have a test environment where you need specific tools all set up, and it saves you time having to configure everything. You can set it up once, take a snapshot of it, and then continually reload EC2 instances with whatever you need. So that's incredibly helpful. And you can come look through all of these different ones that are available, and it'll tell you what they have in them. So like here, this one's got .NET Core, PowerShell, Mono, and Mate already all set up in it in a Linux environment. You can, if you have your own, again, if you've loaded up any of your own images, you can have those in here. There's also the marketplace where you can come look at ones that already have maybe different types of software applications or projects or products built into them and are ready to load. There's also the community AMIs where people set these up and then they release them into the community here where they're free to access. So maybe you want to try out and test something on Debian. You could come in here and see which images are available and sort through that, or you want maybe a Windows instance and you want to make sure that it's on EBS, then you could, you know, come use the filtering tools to find those. So there's a lot of different options for what you want to do. And when you are setting one of these up, like really this is the first thing that you have to decide is what image type do I need, like operating system wise. Over here you can see that some of these have an x86 and an ARM processor that you can choose from. So you can also choose that type of processor environment that you want to work in. And then as you walk through here, let me just pick like this Microsoft one. Oh, again, there's that free tier badge. Let me go back. If you're trying to work within the free tier, you can see some of these are free tier eligible. And that free tier basically means that, you know, if you can keep everything inside of the guidelines that Amazon has defined as being that free tier, then you're not charged for any usage. And so you can see this badge here on all of the ones that are free tier eligible. But when you select these, then you can see that the next thing that you have to choose is that size. So going back to our instance type documentation, we can see this general purpose section, all of these different types in here. So here we can see we're in the general purpose type, and then all of those sizes. If I needed to change, and let's say I'm looking for something more compute optimized, then here's all those compute optimized ones. Again, going back to the documentation, you know, what are the compute optimized ones for? Maybe I'm doing a bunch of media transcoding and I've decided I need one of these compute optimized ones. Then I can see, you know, what do I have available and choose one of those from inside of here. And then as you move through this kind of configuration wizard, it'll have you set up additional details about security and access and networking and things like that that we can get into later. But and then the storage part, adding storage and what type of storage you want to use. So if you're studying for the exam, you know, you'll want to look at kind of the different in this documentation, some of the different use cases for the different types of EC2 instances. Again, thinking about the different storage types that you have available. Yeah, and again, that pricing, it's all based on which one of these sizes you choose. And so if we go back to pricing, here's more information about that free tier. So, so many hours of different type of instances each month. You have to use the micro-sized instances, which are pretty small. They can be kind of slow, but again, if you're not paying for it, you get what you pay for, right? So there is 2 different types of pricing in here. We'll dig into pricing later, but you can read about the pricing and stuff in here of either on-demand or spot instances or reserved instances, and there's savings plans and stuff like that in here, but we'll get into all of the pricing stuff later. We looked at launching one. And really, let's just go through this and do it. Let's just launch one so you can see how to do it. So I'm going to go back to this Windows server. I'm going to select that. Again, if I want to stay inside the free tier, I would have to choose a micro-sized one. So let's just choose a micro-sized one. So we're going to configure some instance details. Now, if you needed to launch 5 of them or something, you could choose that here. Again, that's spot instances. It explains to request spot instances, you specify the maximum price you're willing to pay per instance hour. You want to read all about that, but if you wanted to opt into that, you would check this box. If you are running a specific virtual private network, you could choose which one you want to put that into. If you've set up the networking and everything, you can choose which subnet. But you can see there from your available options, but you can create ones of your own if you don't want to use the default options available. Auto assign it a public IP, and if you're using the default subnet, then yeah, that's what you want to do. If you're using a placement group where they're all talking together like a cluster group, then you would want to check this and add it. Otherwise, it's just standalone. Capacity reservation. So this capacity reservation allows you to specifically launch instances into a server that has matching attributes. Sometimes this is nice if you've got multiple servers all that you want to have like live together on the same machine or something like that. You can do that, but if you have a directory service set up, like a domain directory service, then you can have this server join your domain. IAM roles, these are credentials for AWS. So if you wanted to give someone with a particular role access to this or create a new role, we'll get into roles and access-based stuff later. Shutdown behavior. When you shut down the computer, do you just want to stop it or do you want to terminate it? If you terminate an instance, it's done. The magical cloud robots are going to come and clean it up and throw it away. So default shutdown behavior is just stop, which means that you could then restart it and log back in if you wanted to. You can also enable hibernation if that's something applicable to your server or your web environment. I always turn on this protect against accidental termination because there is a box where there's a drop-down list and it's like, hey, what do you want to do? And terminate is one of the things on there. If you enable this, then it won't let you actually click that. So that's just a nice way, especially if you have multiple people in an account. You just never want an accident to happen. If you want to set up CloudWatch, which is that monitoring service, you can click this, but then of course additional charges may apply because you have to pay for CloudWatch. If you're running a shared, or want this to run in a shared hardware instance, or a dedicated instance or a dedicated host, it will change the pricing model for your instance. Elastic graphics. So if you're wanting to add on hardware-based 3D graphics acceleration, you can put that in here. Again, it will cost more. And then a T2, T3, unlimited to burst above that baseline that we talked about. You can enable that in here. You can add additional network interfaces and adjust any of your network stuff here. Any metadata that you might want to add in, user data, home directory files, stuff like that, you can put that in here. Then we move on to storage. So here we can see the storage type that is being added in automatically. So it's the root volume, and we can see that it's 30 gig in size. It's from that general purpose pool. If we wanted to add a new volume or any additional storage or make this larger, then this is where you could do that. So we're in that free tier, and it's showing us there that free tier customers get 30 gigs of that general purpose or magnetic storage. So, you know, if you didn't change this, it would stay inside of that free tier. But if you did, for whatever reason, for your application, need a larger volume, you could just change this here in the box, or you could add a new volume, or you can change this to that provisioned IOPS or that magnetic type if you wanted to change to one of those storage types that we talked about. Next, you add any tags. If you have key value pairs that you would want to add in here, tags that allow you to monitor and report on particular EC2 resources. You know, we talked about the accounting department scenario and them needing to keep track of resources from a particular department. This is where you can add in those kinds of tags. Your security group. This is a set of firewall rules that allows traffic in and out of your instance. So if you don't want this to be maybe publicly accessible, you want it to only be accessible to maybe other servers in your security group, or none at all, or restrict access to certain ports, this is where you can set that up. And if you already have an existing security group, you can come in here and choose one. If you need a new security group, then this is where you can put that in. Sorry, I'm getting pings. All right, and then once you're all done, you get this review and launch. And if you have any things that, you know, the system wants to call out, like in this case, I set that default security group to just open, so like anyone can connect to it if they have the IP address. It's like, hey, maybe you don't want to do that. It's not a great idea. But it gives you a little overview of, you know, what's the image that you're using, the instance type, the security groups. You can dig into this storage, tags, everything that maybe you chose. And at this point, you're all done. You're ready to launch. And so if we want to launch, and I'll just go ahead and launch this one, we'll launch it. And here's a big thing. How do you log into it once you have it up and running? So a key pair consists of a public key that AWS stores and a private key file that you store and keep secure. Together, they allow you to connect to your instance securely and keep out, you know, like man-in-the-middle type attacks and things like that. So because you don't set up this computer, right? It's a Windows server. It's gonna have an admin account login, and you don't have the password for it. This is how you get the password. And so if you already have an existing key value pair set up for your password usage on AWS, then you can use the same existing key pair. If you want to create a new key pair, you can do that in here, and you give it a name. So I'm going to name this one just Test Key Pair 2020. And you want to download it. And you download it, and when you download it, you get a PEM file, a PEM file. And you need to store it in a secure but accessible location. You will not be allowed to access or download this file again. So it's very important that you keep it safe and you don't lose it, because if you do, you will no longer have access to log into and have the password and things to your instance that uses this key value pair. So it's very important. So I downloaded my PEM file. I have it. Windows is very ticked because I just clicked it. And so now we can launch. And so it's going to give us some little updates, and then it's going to say your instance is launching. There's a launch log if you want to go look at the log. If you want to set up billing alerts, there's lots of good stuff. If we just come back to our instance dashboard, here's that one that was already running, and now we can see this new one, which is pending. And so it's gonna sit here and load for a minute and pend, and then once it's up, I'll show you how you can log into it using something like remote desktop and how you get your password. So while we're waiting on that, I'm gonna come back over here. I'm actually gonna commit this document just in case, so we don't lose anything that we've written so far. So what maybe have we not covered about EC2? I think that might be everything. Like I said, we're gonna dig more into pricing and things later. You know, we talked about the features and functionality. I honestly, EC2 is one of those types that I use quite a bit, just simply because when I need like a small test environment or I'm trying something out, and I don't have access to a Linux computer, but I have access to Linux on EC2, so that gives me that availability. There are no such thing as virtual Mac instances, so that still kind of stinks. But maybe I need an older Windows Server version or something like that. Or I just need like a small little server that's just gonna sit up there and hang out and be available and do something for me for a small amount of time. Or maybe I want to run my whole operation through EC2. I mean, there's plenty of organizations, as you saw in the little case study overview section of like who uses EC2, that, you know, places like Airbnb, like they're using it. You've got all of these places that are just like, I want to be able to bring up virtual servers. I want to be able to change capacity. I want to be able to make sure my stuff works and it's accessible. And so that's ultimately what it's for. And I think if you get to using it, you'll use it quite a bit. All right, so our instance is done. Here it is. We can see it's running. So we can't quite log into it yet. It's initializing. And if you actually go into the log, you could go see kind of like what is it doing right now. Here's kind of some things, you know. If you right click on the items in your console, here we can see connect. We can go ahead and get the files that we need to connect. So it tells you have two different options on this Windows server, a standalone RDP client or a session manager. If you choose these, you know, it'll change what you have. I said we're going to use a standalone RDP client so we can download the remote desktop file, and it's already got the IP address and everything. But we can see here the public DNS, the username, which is just the default administrator account, and then it says get password. So to get your password, you have to have that PEM file that we talked about. And so you can either choose to find that PEM file, or you can paste the contents of it in here and then click decrypt password, and it will give you the password to the instance. So I'm gonna do that, but I'm gonna do it over here. Oops, I can't move this window over here. I'm gonna do it over here off stream because I don't need you connecting to my my poor little instance computer here and doing something nasty with it. But I'm choosing my key value pair. It shows me my RSA private key in that window. And then I click decrypt password, and it gives me a very long, secure password that I can now put over here. And then I can close this window. All right, so the status checks are done. it's all ready for me to log into. I have my RDP file. And so if I launch my RDP client, it's gonna ask me, all right, here we're connecting to this. You have this administrator account. I have the password that I decrypt using my PIM. It's really long. And usually the first time you connect, it's like, here's the certificate. Are you sure you want to connect to this computer? You can say, don't ask me again if you want. And then we should start, oh, there we go. Logging into our server. Now this poor, I did this wrong with this Windows remote desktop window. I meant to make it a window, but here you can see what it's doing. So we'll wait for it to come up. First time a user logs into a Windows computer, you know, it takes a little bit, so we'll give it just a minute. Here it is. All right, now it's like huge, right? I've got it like shrunk down into a little window, but there's a couple of little things on here to help you out with EC2, but I mean, it's just a regular Windows server. I could now come in here and do whatever I wanted to do with this little thing. If I wanted to add files to it or install anything on it or do whatever I wanted to do. Now, when I'm done with my remote session, I can just close out. If I don't want to pay for uptime, I can just stop the instance. So here in the instance state menu, you can see that there's stop and hibernate, but we don't have hibernate enabled. You can reboot it from here. If you terminate it, you're going to destroy it. So you have to make sure that you understand the difference between the two. If you stop it, then it's here and ready for the next time that you want to use it. It's not publicly accessible because it's not running. So if it's like an on-demand web application, then of course you wouldn't want to stop it because then your users can't get to your web application. But if you're just using it for a test environment and you're paying for uptime, then of course you'd want to stop it when you're not using it. Other things in here, you can edit tags, you can change roles, you can play with a lot of the things that you were able to customize in the launch wizard. If you wanted to create an image from this instance, so like maybe I came in here, I installed a bunch of tools, I did some configuration, and this is my default test environment that I want to use every time. I can create an image now from this particular instance to be able to use that to make other instances in the future. If I want to change or set up any networking, linking, CloudWatch, like all of that happens here in the menu. So right now I can stop and it'll say any data in the ephemeral storage of your instances will be lost. Ephemeral storage is like RAM, right? When you shut down your Windows computer, anything you had like in your clipboard or in RAM is gone, right? That's ephemeral storage. So we're gonna be like, yes, stop. And it's doing it. And in a second, it's gonna show us that the instance state is now stopped. So that's all it takes to set up a web server in the cloud and be able to access it and then be able to do whatever you need to do with it. And then what we're gonna do, I'm getting an error on my status checks. What's it say? Oh, unable to describe. That's okay. Okay. If it's taken some time to refresh, you can come up here and hit refresh. So now we can see this particular instance is stopped. And then what if I want to get rid of it entirely and remove it? So I'm not paying for, because even though the server is stopped, you're still paying for storage because that storage pricing again is separate. So I can come down here to volumes. Now you can see I have two different volumes. One is the server that was launched back in March and one is the server launched today. You can see that, you know, if they're in use in their particular instances and which instance they belong to. But I'm paying for this storage whether that server is on or not, because that the storage persists. So what if I want to get rid of all of this? I want to make sure I'm not going to pay for anything and I don't want this server anymore. So we can terminate it, but remember we can't come in here and click terminate because it says that terminate protection is on. So this is what I was talking about. It's always nice to have this feature on. There's also some things on here about on an EBS backed instance. Remember we talked about EBS storage. The root EBS volume will be deleted when the instance is terminated. So if you had something on the root drive of this server and you didn't want to lose it, then you want to make sure that you take that volume and attach it to a different server before you delete this, because otherwise when you delete it, it's going to delete the storage as well. So hopefully that makes sense. So because the termination protection is on, we have to go change that before we would be allowed to change that. So you would come in here to your instance settings and click change termination protection. And yes, disable. And now we can come in here to instance state, terminate, yes. And so this is going to delete the server and it's going to delete the storage and it's all going to be gone. So we can see here that our state is terminated, and in a few minutes this will just leave the dashboard entirely. You can filter by terminated instances if you needed to come in here and look at that. And then we can come into our volumes and see that volume is gone. So hopefully that covers EC2 and how to use it. If you have an AWS account, you can come in and practice some of these things yourself, which I encourage you to do. So what are we going to talk about next? We're going to talk about Elastic Beanstalk. They have such nice names, don't they? So let's pull up the documentation for Elastic Beanstalk. And get this put into our document. Okay, Elastic Beanstalk. So this is how you can deploy kind of web applications and web services and things like Apache or Docker and stuff like that in a place where we don't really have to think about servers. So let's see here, where do we want to start? This is really a different compute option available on the platform. So it's automates the process of deploying and scaling your workloads on EC2. So let's see here. I want to keep the formatting the same. But again, we don't have to think about servers. So remember when we talked about different types of cloud infrastructure and different types of models? This is really that part where we start to talk about infrastructure as a service, because this is more of a platform as a service type approach. It supports a specific set of technologies, unlike EC2, which is about hardware and storage. So we can see on the page here, that it talks about deploying and scaling things like Java, .NET, PHP, Node, like all of these different technologies. And that's really what it's about. It's like focusing more on the technology than it is about thinking about the hardware. It allows you to how do I want to phrase this? Allows you to set up all types of applications using different languages or technologies, and get it up and running on a server without having to think about the hardware considerations. That's probably the best way to put that. And the idea here is supposed to make it like really easy to use. Not that like EC2 isn't really easy to use, but the process of managing those servers and handling things like provisioning and load balancing and scaling and monitoring and everything are all handled automatically through the Elastic Beanstalk. Right. So a lot of times the big question that people get hung up on is like, what platform does it support? Or like, so let's say you are writing in something like Java or .NET, PHP or whatever, Python, Ruby, Go, any of the ones that it says, that it supports. It even supports things like Docker, if you're familiar with Docker. And the good thing here is that if you're using one of these platforms to write your applications, then you don't have to worry about that hardware consideration. The advantage is just being able to upload your code, essentially, and it has integrated monitoring, so we don't have to worry about any of those things. And so if we come into the benefits section, they talk about you can deploy your application. If you have like a Git repository or from inside Visual Studio, it automatically handles all of the deployment details. Like, you don't have to think about any of these things, which for software developers that have never really gotten into or taken like a hardware networking type class, that are really kind of lacking on maybe those IT skills, Elastic Beanstalk is like the holy grail, right? Because you don't have to worry about your infrastructure. It just manages the application stack for you. So all you have to think about is the code and uploading your applications. That's it. It does have some of those features in there. It talks about impossible to outgrow. It will automatically scale your application up and down based on need. You can adjust those auto scaling sections, CPU utilization. You can set the thresholds and metrics for that. There's a lot of customization that you can do. So if it starts to stretch beyond where it needs to be in order to perform well, you can set those thresholds for what your application needs and not have to stick with what the system thinks. So yeah, that's in a nutshell what Elastic Beanstalk looks like, or what it does. So let's look at it in the console. I think this is why I like doing this in the console. So here it's under the compute section, right? Elastic Beanstalk. And I didn't prep any code for this, and maybe I should have. So it gives you this little thing, like how it works. You simply upload your code, and Elastic Beanstalk automatically handles the deployment from capacity provisioning, load balancing, and automatic scaling to web application health monitoring with ongoing, fully managed patch and security updates. So to create your application, right, you click Create Application, you give it a name, whatever you want to name it. You can give it those tags, again, like with EC2, these are, key value pairs, unique within the resource for reporting and cataloging purposes, if you needed to create tags. So then it asks you for a platform. Here are the ones that it supports. So we have .NET on Windows Server. Docker, which again, if you're not familiar with Docker, really allows you to just set up and configure a particular environment the way that it needs to be for your application. Things like Glassfish, Go, Java, Node.js, PHP, Python, Ruby, and Tomcat. If I have any code, it's going to be in .NET. So I can go pull something out of a repository or something to make this work. If you need a specific version of IIS or a specific version of Windows Server, this is where you can choose that, and then a platform version. They have sample code, so if you actually wanted to set up this application, you didn't have code yet, you can do the sample application. Maybe that's what we should do instead of me going trying to pull from a repo. Or you can upload your code, and you can see here that like it's a local file, or you've got it in an S3 bucket, or how you want to upload your stuff. Let's go with the sample. We'll click Create, and it'll go through its steps and give you some feedback on the overview here as it does it. Here we can see it's kind of like a log view. There are a couple of different deployment options if you wanted to, and I'll put this in the doc. Let's see, different deployment options. You can upload your code through the console, like you saw there when I was launching the application. You can do it through the Elastic Beanstalk CLI. There is a connector for Visual Studio. There is a connector for Eclipse. That's it. So there are multiple different ways that you can connect into Elastic Beanstalk to upload your applications. Oops. And then, it has the health monitoring. So there's a bunch of different metrics that Beanstalk will use. I think that probably belongs up here in key features. You don't have to worry about like management updates. They apply patches and platform version updates and stuff like that. We talked about the scaling, customization. They have various compliance. I know we haven't talked about compliance really yet, but if you had like particular compliance needs. It's still going. Pricing wise, you can come in here to the pricing page. You only pay for, again, what you're using, but that's EC2 instances or S3 buckets that are used to create and store and run your application. So Beanstalk itself doesn't have pricing, but you're still going to pay for the EC2 pricing and the S2 pricing, or if you're using any databases, any database resources that are necessary to make your application work. And so this is where using these calculators that we talked about last time are important, because again, if you're not thinking about the hardware and you're not doing any research on the hardware or the storage, then you might quickly find that you are going over any pricing that you were trying to keep within. All right, it's almost done. So we can see in here, it's set up an S3 storage bucket. I know we haven't talked about S3 yet, but this is basically a storage location in the cloud for files and things that it would need. It's created a new security group. It's creating an EC2 instance, getting that launched, and getting that set up. So it's bringing up all of these resources that you can use. And then once it's up and running, we can also look at the dashboard. So again, the idea here is you have your application, it's maybe already written, it lives in a Git repository, or you have like an IDE like Visual Studio and you're working on your application, and you can continually upload it to Elastic Beanstalk, and Beanstalk automatically handles the details of deployment. So you don't have to do that. You do get some freedom to select these resources. So if you are the kind of person where you're like, I'm just gonna let Elastic Beanstalk decide what's best for me and my application, and I don't wanna have to think about this or research this or worry about this, you can do that. If you are the kind of person that does wanna get under the hood and retain some control over the resources that are powering your application, you can do that too. So you don't have to take the default configuration, and here it's still going. So we can't really dig into some of these things yet. But here we can see the environment, env. Here's all the environment stuff. The application itself, we can come up and see this application version. Here's that sample application. If you click on this, you know, it'll show you some resources and things like that. And then if you have saved configurations, this is where they would show up. Here's like when we looked at that primary overview of EC2, this will show you kind of all of your environments that you currently have in the Beanstalk, as well as your applications that you currently have in the Beanstalk. And here's where you can create a new application or a new environment. You can create new environments and move applications to the environment. Here we can see the URL that's automatically set up as the public URL, but there's currently nothing that you can see. It doesn't set up like the public IIS page or anything like that. Or maybe it will. I haven't looked at this sample application, but it's still pending, so it's probably still doing what it's doing. We can come back in here and see, what are we doing? Yeah, it's not done yet. It does take a few minutes to get it up and running. But I think that's maybe everything I can say about Beanstalk. Let's go ahead and commit. It is really useful if you are maybe working with various applications and you want to focus on writing code rather than spending time managing, configuring servers and databases and load balancers. And sure, why not? Come on, Beanstalk. Well, the nice thing about the cloud is you can just leave it to run and do whatever it needs to do while that's happening. I think I talked about everything I'm going to talk about with Beanstalk, at least until it's up and running. What's the next thing we're going to talk about? And then we can come back and look at it. I think I'm going to cover one more thing today, and that's AWS Lambda. Lambda is probably one of my favorite services. Mostly because I think it's really cool. It does some really cool stuff. All right, so we'll come back to our Elastic Beanstalk and make sure it's set up and everything so we can play with it and you can kind of take a look at it in the console. But AWS Lambda, basically what it does is it allows you to run code like Beanstalk without provisioning or managing servers, but it really comes down to virtually any type of application or backend service where you're only paying for compute time. Duration of time it takes for code to execute. And so all of those times that your maybe your software development professors were getting on to you about inefficient code and how long it takes for you to run things, this is when it counts, because Lambda counts a request each time it starts executing in response to your event or when the call is invoked. And then it runs that until the nearest 100 milliseconds, and then that's what you're charged for. You do have some free tier usage for Lambda. You get 1 million free requests and 400,000 gigabyte seconds of compute time every month, which is phenomenal. And as you learn about Lambda, hopefully you think it's as cool as I do. This is what the Echo product, I don't want to say her name because I have one in the room and I forgot to turn it off, runs on. You know, her name starts with an A. But it runs entirely on the back of Lambda. And if you ever get into, or I think I probably have the video up where I made the Echo skill, and you want to maybe learn how to write these for that A-word person yourself. A-word person sounds awful. Then it's super easy, and you just use Lambda and you can use your free tier and you don't even have to pay. So yeah, it's really cool. Zero administration, kind of a high level idea of the cloud where you run code, like I said, in basically can run code for virtually any type of application or back-end service. Zero administration. You just upload your code, Lambda takes care of everything else. What else can we say about Lambda? What other features do we have? Serverless computing. So you're charged only for execution time. You can choose to have anywhere between 128 and 3,000 megabytes allocated. Megabytes allocated for your functions. And really that's the way Lambda works, is it's function based. And everything has kind of an event-driven workflow. All right, so let me go look. This is still running. So we'll come back to our Elastic Beanstalk. Oh wait, I think maybe it just refreshed. Environment health is transitioned from pending okay. 19 seconds ago, took 10 minutes. Okay, it looks like it's up now. Does this work? Did it set up anything? Oh, look at that. Okay. So this is what our test application in Beanstalk looks like. So again, this is where you can see your environment. This is the public URL for your environment. So basically it's a sample web application running on a Windows server in IIS. You can come into the application and dig into it a little bit over here in the application side of things. Let's see. There's a way. I haven't done this in a while because I don't use Beanstalk as much as I use Lambda and EC2. Oh, here we go. The sample application. It gives us some details, and I've not looked at this sample application. So we can see here that there's a couple of different ones depending on which environment you pick. We picked the .NET. You can download the zip file if you want to look at the files that are inside. But really the idea here is that we didn't have to do anything to make this little web application work. So if we look at the public URL here, we can see it's serving pages. It's got some links. It's probably got a style sheet. It's got some different things. We could actually just take the time. Let's go look. Let's just take the time to go. Let's come back over to this page. And let's download this zip file. And what's in this folder? Let's get this puppy open. All right, here's what's in it. So there is a couple of XML files that have information about the application. We can see there's a style sheet. There's a default page, right? There's that congratulations, your AWS Elastic Beanstalk ASP.NET application is now running. Here is the environment properties page. And then like any other, if you're not familiar with ASP.NET, this looks pretty standard to an ASP.NET application, but that's what's inside of here. So if we'd wrote this application and then loaded it up on Beanstalk, then it created a server and it set up IIS for us and got everything running so that now we are serving this page and are able to do that. So that's essentially how Beanstalk works. You can come into this environment section. You can, that's not what I wanted. You can look at, what kind of what's under the hood. You can mess with anything in here that you want to mess with if you want to configure things a little more specifically. There's log files that it will generate. There's that health section. So if you want to dig into what's going on with kind of all of your responses and latency and CPU and all of the different points that go in. Oh, here's the monitoring dashboard I was talking about. So, usually you would have to configure CloudWatch and everything for your EC2 instances and then, monitor all of these things, but Beanstalk sets that up for you automatically. So that's kind of one of the perks. Then you can also set up alarms. So if you wanted to say like, oh my gosh, we've got too much CPU usage, something's going on with the application, or maybe there's a stuck process and we're using, too much CPU, or we've got a memory leak somewhere and we've chewed through a bunch of RAM, you can set up alarms based on, any of these things that are in the monitoring dashboard. Events, it's kind of an event log of all the things that we could see when it was getting started. And then tags, if you needed to modify any of those tags for your reporting. Pretty cool, huh? So what if we wanted to kill it, like we did with EC2? So you can terminate the environment in here in the environment section. Over here in the applications, you can delete the application but keep the environment. So if you had an environment, maybe you made some change to your application, you didn't like it, you could delete the application, re-upload it into the same environment. What it will tell you, if you come over here to the environment with a running application and terminate it, and I don't know if you could see, there's a bunch of different options in here. You can like swap URLs, clone the environment if you wanted to keep it, like make another one of the same type. You can restart it, you can rebuild it. If you terminate it, it'll tell you, here's all the stuff. If you proceed, this application that you have running, or this environment that you have running, will be released. So you're gonna get rid of it. Any resources associated will be destroyed. And you actually have to type the name, which is this name right here, in order to get rid of it. And then you can click terminate. And so then you can go through, you can see this in the process here. So it'll take this a minute. While we're doing that, let's go look at Lambda. So Lambda's in the compute section, and I'm gonna open it in a new tab so I can come back to this fast. Now you can see I have a lot of Lambda functions up here because, like I said, I use Lambda quite a bit. And then, if you're using the Echo service because you've written a skill, I have a skill up here, a couple of different ones, in fact. And then I also have an Amazon Deep Lens, which is like a machine learning camera. And you can see that there's a couple of functions that get loaded into Lambda that are Python functions. And do not delete for proper functioning of your Deep Lens. So there's a lot of things that run on Lambda. And so we can dig into what one of these looks like, and you can see there's lots of different run times that you can select depending on maybe what you need for your application. So let's just pick one of these that I wrote for. This is a microservice actually for a web application that uses Kinesis. And it's currently not working because it's old. But actually, let's pick one that maybe does work. Okay, so here we can see, I'm gonna have to disable my Alexa, I think. I don't know, maybe she can't hear me say her name really soft. All right, so this is for the Alexa Skills Kit. The skill itself is called Yoga Break, and this was for a demo that I did on how to use .NET, which in this case .NET Core 2.1, so that if you already know how to use C#, which C# is my language of choice, how to write these skills for Echo. And you can see that there's a lot of things in here, with Lambda, but some of this hopefully is starting to sound similar. So you have your function code. So what's the code that you want to run? And you can upload it as a zip file. You choose the runtime that you want. You can see here are all of the supported runtimes. And then you can also set up a custom runtime. And then the handler, this is inside of here based on like a function name. It's kind of a value function name. So I uploaded the zip file package. If you have environmental variables, you can set those up. Tags, again, we know what tags are. If you want to adjust your memory settings, again, you can change that between 128 and 3000. You've got things like timeouts, so how long between when it was called to, it ran, and then it just kind of like hangs out for a second, and it's like, am I gonna get called again? If not, it'll kind of go back into that dormant mode. So I've got a 30-second timeout. X-ray is active tracing for record timing. If you're having like error information, you can turn on X-ray. If you have a VPC that you want this to run inside, you can set that up for your networking. If not, you can leave it alone. Concurrency. So concurrency is where you can enable your function to scale without fluctuations in latency. So if this is like a really high demand function, it's getting hit over and over and over like thousands of times all the time, then you can set up some concurrency. Otherwise, if it's the kind of function that maybe gets called a few times an hour or whatever, then it's not necessary. Asynchronous invocation, if you want to allow that, you can set that up. And then if you have a database, which I didn't, you can set up any database proxies in here. So it's very graphical. You can come in here and change any permissions. There is a resource policy, which is in a JSON format. And then monitoring sets this up in CloudWatch so you can have some monitoring of kind of what's happening as things call your function. Now, if no one's using the skill, then this is a very low use function. I haven't even checked on this skill in a long time to be able to tell you how many people have it installed, but that's basically how it works. If we come back to the dashboard, you can see kind of all of these different functions and kind of like what you've got going on in here. What else can I show you? Oh, the test. You can configure in a JSON format like a test event, and then test it to make sure that it's working the way that you think it's going to work. All of these ones on the older .NET platform, .NET Core 2.0, aren't going to work anymore. They're old. And if I wasn't using them, I didn't bother to update them to 2.1. Yeah, I don't have any saved test events in here. I don't know if I can show you how to create a function because I don't have. They do have, so there's these blueprints, which is like preset stuff that usually has to do with other AWS functions. So it's like, working with Kinesis and Firehose, or working with CloudFront, working with Kinesis Analytics, working with DynamoDB. They have all of these kind of pre-made ones. And then there's this app repository where people can add their skills or things that they wanted to upload. And then you can go play with those. So it's like, oh, you wanted to build a skill for Echo in Node.js that's like a trivia skill. Then there's already a template for that and you could go grab that. So yeah, there's a couple of different ones like that you could just go get this. Like here's one, a basic skill built for Alexa that's like a color expert. So you can just play with these. If you didn't have your own code, you could come in here and play with some of the ones that are already kind of set up. One of the probably most useful functions and why I use them sometimes in mobile applications is this right here, microservice HTTP endpoint. So if you have a database and you need a quick read-write application to serve just like as a RESTful API endpoint, that Lambda is huge. This is so nice. You don't have to go set up a server. I don't have to worry about the server running all the time to serve the mobile application. I could see how much it's being used, and there's a lot of great monitoring and tools and stuff like that. So this is essentially what Lambda is all about. What else can I say about Lambda that we can add into our document? Let's see, great for serving HTTP requests via Amazon's API gateway, modification to objects in S3 buckets. I wrote that backwards. Table updates to DynamoDB. And then echo Alexa skills. Yeah, great for all of those things. See, I knew I was gonna set her off. Alexa, stop. See, I knew I was gonna set her off. I said her name so many times, she never heard me. I wasn't quiet enough. Don't talk about the robot. Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot of benefits to this kind of computing, right? You know, we have reduced, let's put this in here, benefits. Reduced maintenance requirements. We don't have to worry about underlying servers and keep them up to date. What else? Enables fault tolerance without having to think about it or build it in. Runs across multiple availability zones. I don't think I talked about that. So no single point of failure can take down your application, and it's available everywhere, which is awesome. Scales based on demand. I'm having trouble today. So it doesn't matter how many users you have for your particular Lambda function, you know that it will scale and your pricing is based on that direct usage. Whereas with things like EC2, you have that server up and running, and you know, if it supports 1,000 people, that's great. But if you only have 10 people using it, you're paying for that whole server. But with Lambda, it truly maps your pricing directly to your usage, and it's only going to charge you based on that compute time. So I think we have, do I want to do scenarios now? Do I want to wait until I get through core services? Let's hold off on scenarios for now. And let's do all of like the scenarios and the questions when I get to the end of all of these. I think next what we'll talk about are the content and network delivery services. So let's see, these were, let's see, core services, and then let's do, these were compute services, and then so EC2 and Beanstalk and Lambda are compute services, and then we have content and network delivery services. We're going to talk about Amazon VPC and Direct Connect. We're going to talk about Route 53, which I'd mentioned previously. Elastic, doing the wrong thing. Load balancing. CloudFront and API Gateway. And then we got to talk about file storage services. I'm just heading all of this out so we know what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Amazon S3, Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive, Elastic Block Store, and Elastic File System. AWS Snowball. I love the names of some of these things. We gotta talk about databases. So much to cover, guys. The relational database service. DynamoDB. Elasticache and Redshift. And then we got to talk about app integration services. That's things like AWS messaging and step functions. That's it. And then we'll do scenario review. So, as you can see, there's a lot of stuff to talk about. So if you need this document so that you can go through and look at all the things that I've been working on and get these notes and links and things, exclamation point GitHub. Got all of this in my repository, AWS resources, starting with the Cloud Practitioner doc. This is where I've been putting some kind of key links and resources, and then the links to each one of the domain documents as I fill these out. But we will continue this later next week and continue talking about all of these different services so that you understand, you know, what they are and how to use them and why they're important and things like that, so that you can be ready for the kinds of questions that you're asked on the exam, or just being a little more fluent in AWS's cloud system and that infrastructure that they provide and what is possible. Because I think a lot of people just don't even realize what's possible up on the cloud and what are all of these services and how do they work. So if you hung with me today, and you know, I appreciate you. I know it's Friday afternoon. This might not be as exciting to you as it is to me, but if you are looking to kind of further your career in this area, then this is the kind of content that you want to learn. So if you have questions, feel free and reach out. You can hit me up on Discord. The information is in the on my Twitch page. You can also reach out to me on Twitter at the Rhysma. So that's the RHYSMA. But otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your Friday afternoon, and I will see you later.